The finality of the courthouse door closing behind her was a sound like a hammer striking stone. It was a dull, heavy thud that sealed off one life and began another. Eliza Davies stood on the dusty steps, 26 years old and a widow for 2 months. In her hand, she clutched the only 2 things her husband's family had seen fit to leave her: a deed to a worthless patch of land and 5 silver dollars. The coins were cold against her palm, a meager and insulting payment for 2 years of marriage and a lifetime of shared dreams. Her brother-in-law, Marcus, had stood before the judge, his face a mask of solemn duty that failed to hide the triumphant glint in his eyes. He spoke of family obligation, of protecting the farm that had been in their name for 3 generations. He painted Thomas, her late husband, as a dreamer, a man whose judgment was clouded by affection. And he painted Eliza as the source of that distraction. The farm, the house she had kept, the fields she had helped plow, it all reverted to him, the responsible elder brother. Her claim was dissolved with a signature and a gavel's rap. She was left with Thomas's folly. That's what they called it. A 5-acre plot of sun-baked rock and scrub 3 miles north of Providence Creek, which Thomas had bought in a fit of optimism, believing he could quarry the stone. But the stone was brittle shale, useless for building, and the land grew nothing but weeds with roots like iron. Its only feature was a deep, stone-lined well, dug by the original settlers a century ago, which had run dry before their first winter. It was a joke, a piece of land worth less than the paper the deed was printed on. The community of Providence Creek watched her descent from the courthouse steps. She saw pity in the eyes of the women, a cold assessment in the eyes of the men. They saw a problem to be managed. Mr. Gable, the owner of the town mercantile, cleared his throat and offered a piece of practical advice. Sell the deed for whatever you can get, Eliza. A few dollars, maybe. Enough for a coach ticket east. There's nothing for you here now. His words were meant to be kind, but they felt like another door closing in her face. Marcus made his own offer, a final twist of the knife disguised as charity. He approached her on the street, his shadow falling over her like a shroud. "You can have a room at the farm," he said, his voice loud enough for half the town to hear. "In the servants' quarters. You can help the cook. It's the least we can do for Thomas's memory." The humiliation burned in her throat, hot and bitter. To become a servant in the home that should have been hers, to live under the thumb of the man who had taken everything from her. It was a fate worse than starving. She looked at his polished boots, then at the worn leather of her own. She looked at the 5 silver dollars in her hand, and then she looked past him, toward the barren hills to the north. A quiet, cold resolve settled in her bones. It was not a grand or heroic feeling. It was the simple animal instinct to refuse to lie down and die. "No," she said, her voice barely a whisper, but it carried the weight of an unbreakable vow. "The land is mine. I'll keep it." A murmur went through the onlookers. Foolish, proud, doomed. The words hung in the air, unspoken but understood. Marcus simply shook his head with a condescending sigh. "Have it your way. Don't come begging when the first snow falls." He turned and walked away, his part in the drama concluded. Eliza did not watch him go. She turned and walked in the opposite direction, toward Gable's mercantile. The pitying eyes followed her. Inside, the air smelled of coffee beans, leather, and salt. She ignored the staples, the things a woman starting a home would buy. She walked past the bolts of calico and the barrels of flour. Her gaze was fixed on the wall of tools. She laid 3 of her $5 on the counter. "I need a good axe," she said, "and a shovel." Mr. Gable looked at the coins, then at her. He started to protest, to offer advice again, but something in her expression stopped him. He wordlessly selected a single-bit axe with a hickory handle and a sturdy spade with a sharp edge. He then added a coil of thick rope and a small sack. "On the house," he mumbled, pushing the rope and sack forward. For Thomas." She nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. She bought a small bag of salt and another of cornmeal with her remaining money. Outside, she paused. Thomas's old dog, Buster, a scruffy brown mutt with one floppy ear, had been waiting for her, tied to a post. He whined softly, pressing his head against her leg. He was the last living piece of her husband, and they had let her keep him. She untied his rope, looped it through her belt, shouldered the axe and shovel, and turned her back on Providence Creek. She did not look back. She walked north, toward the Folly, the dog trotting faithfully at her side. The journey was a punishment. The sun beat down on the cracked earth, and the weight of the tools dug into her shoulders. The landscape grew harsher with every step, the sparse grass giving way to gravel and sharp-edged shale. Providence Creek disappeared behind a low rise, and with it the last vestige of the life she had known. The silence was absolute, broken only by the crunch of her boots, the panting of the dog, and the ceaseless whisper of the wind. She was utterly alone, walking toward a piece of land that everyone agreed was a grave. When she finally arrived, the sun was low in the sky, painting the desolate hills in shades of orange and purple. The plot was just as she remembered, just as everyone had described. It was a scar on the face of the land. A few skeletal trees clung to life, their branches twisted by the wind. The ground was a carpet of broken rock, and in the center of it all was the well. It was a perfect circle of expertly laid stones, a testament to the hope of the men who had built it. The circle was about 4 feet across, its lip crumbling with age. She crept to the edge and peered down. It was a tube of blackness, a throat leading into the deep earth. She dropped a small stone and waited. 1 second, 2, 3. Then a faint clink echoed up from the bottom. It was deep, and it was dry. A wave of despair so profound it made her knees weak washed over her. The town was right. Marcus was right. This was not a home. It was a hole, a tomb. She sank to the ground, the rough shale biting into her palms. Tears she had refused to shed in the courthouse now came, hot and silent. Buster nudged her hand, whining his concern, but she was lost in the vastness of her desolation. The wind picked up, a cold and mournful sound that seemed to mock her foolish pride. For a long, dark moment, she considered simply lying down and letting the cold of the night take her. It would be easier than this. But as she sat there, shivering in the twilight, she felt something strange. A draft. It wasn't the wind that swept across the plains. This was different. It was a slow, steady exhalation of air from the mouth of the well. She crawled closer, her grief momentarily forgotten, replaced by curiosity. She held her hand over the opening. The air coming out was cool, much cooler than the surrounding evening air, and it felt damp. It carried a scent she recognized but couldn't place, the smell of a root cellar, of deep earth, of things growing in the dark. It smelled alive. Her heart began to beat a little faster. This wasn't the stagnant, dead air of a sealed pit. It was moving. It was breathing. She untied the new rope from her pack, tied one end around the handle of her lantern, lit the wick, and carefully lowered it into the blackness. The circle of light descended, illuminating the rough-hewn stone walls of the well shaft. Down and down it went, 20 feet, 30, 40. Then the light changed. It stopped shrinking and began to spread out, revealing that the narrow shaft opened into something wider. She lowered it another 10 feet until the rope went slack. The lantern now rested on the well's floor, casting a flickering glow on its surroundings. It was not just a well. At the bottom, the shaft opened into a small, natural cavern, a limestone hollow perhaps 15 feet across. The walls of the cavern glistened with moisture, tiny beads of water catching the light like 1,000 scattered diamonds. The air that had smelled so strange was rising from this hidden chamber, a pocket of the deep earth that held its own climate, its own breath. The well wasn't a worthless hole. It was a doorway. And in that moment, staring down at the impossible, life-giving dampness in the heart of a drought-stricken land, Eliza felt the first flicker of something that was not despair. It was a grim, ferocious hope. The first task was shelter. She could not live in the well, but she could live over it, harnessing its strange properties. The plot was covered in the very shale that made it worthless for farming. For her, it was a quarry. For days, her world shrank to the agony of labor. She used her shovel as a lever, prying loose, flat, heavy stones from the earth. She hauled them, one by one, to the wellhead. Her hands, soft from her life as a farmer's wife, were rubbed raw within the first hour. By the end of the first day, they were a mess of broken blisters and blood. She tore strips from her petticoat to wrap them, and kept working. Muscles she didn't know she had screamed in protest. Her back felt as if it would snap. Each stone was a victory, each foot of wall a triumph against the voice in her head that whispered of failure. She built a low, circular wall around the well, about 10 feet in diameter, leaving a gap for a door. It was crude work, the stones uneven, but it was solid. It was a start. Next came the wood. The few trees on her plot were thin and bent, but they would have to do. Learning to use the axe was a brutal education. Her first few swings missed the mark wildly, jarring her arms to the shoulder. But she learned. She learned to read the grain, to strike with the rhythm of her own breath. The crack of the wood splitting was the most satisfying sound in the world. She felled the trees, stripped their branches, and dragged the logs to her stone circle. It took her a week to gather enough. She built the walls of her hut atop the stone foundation, notching the logs with clumsy, powerful blows of the axe. It was a small, ugly structure, more of a bunker than a cabin. She filled the gaps between the logs with a mixture of mud, dry grass, and her own stubborn will. For the roof, she laid a frame of smaller logs and covered it with layers of bark, sod, and anything else she could find, creating a thick, insulating layer. The well was now inside her home, a gaping hole in the middle of her dirt floor. Her water source was the next problem. The cavern at the bottom of the well was damp, but there was no pool, no spring. She descended the rope for the first time, her patched hands burning with every foot. The air in the cavern was cool and still. The walls were weeping moisture. She had an idea, born of remembered farm wisdom. She spent 2 days carefully carving shallow grooves into the soft limestone walls with the tip of her shovel, channeling the tiny trickles of condensation downward. At the base of the wall, she dug a shallow basin and lined it with clay she found near a dry creek bed, painstakingly packing it until it was watertight. It was a slow, tedious process. The first day, it collected less than a cup of water, but it was clean, cold, and pure. It was enough. With a rudimentary shelter and a trickle of water, her thoughts turned to food. Her cornmeal and salt would not last forever. Snaring rabbits provided some meat, but it was unreliable. She needed a crop that didn't need sun, that didn't need rain, that could grow in the cool, damp darkness she now controlled. Her grandmother's words came back to her, stories from the old country of growing mushrooms in cellars, of coaxing food from darkness and decay. It was a wild, desperate idea. It was her only idea. She needed supplies. The thought of returning to Providence Creek filled her with dread, but it was necessary. She built a crude travois from 2 long poles and a piece of canvas. Leaving Buster to guard her new home, she made the long walk back to town. Her appearance caused a stir. She was thinner, her face tanned and scratched, her clothes ragged and stained with dirt. Her hands were calloused and wrapped in crude bandages. This was not the respectable widow who had left 2 months prior. This was a wild thing from the hills. The whispers followed her down the main street. "The Folly Girl," someone muttered, and the name stuck. She walked into Gable's Mercantile, her head held high. Mr. Gable stared at her, his expression a mixture of shock and pity. "Eliza," he said softly, "you're alive." "I am," she replied, her voice rough from disuse, "and I need supplies." He expected her to ask for flour, beans, charity. Instead, she laid out her request. "I need 3 of your largest burlap sacks, a 20-pound bag of rye grain, and I'll buy any spoiled hay or old manure you have out back." Gable's face was a study in confusion. "Child, what in God's name for? That's not food." "It's for my farm," she said simply, meeting his gaze without flinching. The absurdity of it was too much for him. A farm on that worthless rock? Growing what? Stones? But he saw the steel in her eyes and did not argue. He sold her the goods, his customers watching the bizarre transaction in silence. As she dragged the heavy travois out of town, laden with sacks of grain and manure, she heard a burst of laughter behind her. They thought she was mad. Perhaps she was. But she was also still fighting. Back at her homestead, she began the strangest farming of her life. She boiled the rye grain to sterilize it, then left it in the damp cavern air, hoping to catch the wild spores that seemed to thrive there. It was a gamble, a folk magic she barely understood. While she waited, she hauled the manure, hay, and buckets of dark, rich leaf mold from the woods down into the well, a back-breaking journey up and down the rope. She mixed it all together, creating a rich, earthy substrate. She packed the mixture into the burlap sacks, and into grooves she cut into fallen logs. A few weeks later, she saw it, a fine, white, web-like growth spreading through her grain. The spawn had taken. Carefully, she introduced the spawn to the sacks and logs, arranging them in neat rows in the cavern. Her dark garden was planted. Now all she could do was wait. Her life fell into a rhythm dictated by necessity. Chop wood for the small stone fireplace she'd built against one wall of her hut. Check the snares. Haul water from the cistern. And every day she would lower herself into the cool darkness of the well to tend her strange crop, misting it with water from a bucket, watching for any sign of life. Buster was her shadow, her only companion. At night, he slept curled at her feet, his warmth a small shield against the immense loneliness of her world. The hut was small, but the stable temperature rising from the well moderated the climate. It was cooler in the summer, and, as autumn deepened, warmer than the biting air outside. It required less firewood to keep from freezing, a small but crucial mercy. The town did not forget her. The story of the Folly Girl and her bizarre purchases became a piece of local lore, a cautionary tale about pride and grief. Marcus Davies rode out to her land once that fall. He sat on his fine horse, looking down at her squat, mud-chinked hovel. He saw the smoke curling from her chimney and the axe marks on the logs. He saw her, dressed in patched men's clothes, her face smudged with soot. "Living in a hole," he scoffed, his voice dripping with contempt. "Just as we expected. Thomas would be ashamed to see you like this." He made his humiliating offer one last time. Give up this madness. There is still a place for you. As a maid. Eliza was tending a rabbit roasting over her fire. She did not look up. She simply said, "This is my land, Marcus. Leave it." There was no anger in her voice, only a weariness so profound it was its own kind of strength. He stared at her for a long moment, perhaps seeing for the first time that she was not broken, but forged into something new and unrecognizable. He turned his horse and rode away without another word. Winter arrived like a wolf. The sky turned the color of lead, and the wind carried the scent of snow. Eliza's world shrank to the four walls of her hut and the dark chamber beneath it. The rhythm of her days became a simple loop of survival. Stoke the fire, melt snow for extra water, check the snares, and descend into the well. Down in the cavern, the temperature remained a constant, cool 55 degrees. The outside world could freeze or thaw, but her subterranean garden was untouched. One morning, she lowered her lantern and saw them. On the side of a log, clustered together, were a half-dozen small, perfectly white buttons. They looked like pearls in the lantern light. A miracle. She touched one gently with her finger. It was firm, cool, and alive. She plucked it, climbed back up the rope, and washed it in her precious water. She ate it raw. The flavor was intense, earthy, and rich, the taste of the deep, dark soil from which it came. It was the most delicious thing she had ever eaten. It was the taste of survival. Within 2 weeks, the cavern was full of them. They grew in thick, white clusters from the sacks and logs, a silent, ghostly harvest. She picked them by the basketful, a bounty that seemed impossible in the dead of winter. Her diet changed from stringy rabbit and cornmeal to rich mushroom stews and roasted caps that tasted almost like meat. She had more than she could eat. She began drying them, threading them on strings, and hanging them from the rafters of her hut, where the dry air and wood smoke preserved them perfectly. Section. The winter tested her in other ways. A blizzard buried her hut in snow, and she spent 2 days sealed inside, the wind howling like a banshee. But her sod roof held, and the well-fed fire kept the cold at bay. A pack of hungry wolves, drawn by the scent of her cooking, circled her hut for a night. Buster's ferocious barking from within the sturdy walls, and the glowing embers she threw from the doorway, were enough to keep them from trying the door. Each trial she survived hardened her resolve and deepened her trust in the strange, symbiotic home she had built. She was no longer just surviving. She was presiding over a tiny, thriving kingdom of her own making. Spring came, and with it, a strange sickness on the land. A rust-colored fungus appeared on the wheat stalks in the fields of Providence Creek. It spread with unnatural speed, turning healthy green fields to a withered, decaying brown in a matter of weeks. The corn crop was next, the leaves developing a slimy, black rot. The farmers, Marcus among them, watched in horror as their year's work, their entire livelihood, dissolved into blighted filth before their eyes. Then came the drought. The spring rains never arrived. The sky remained a pale, unforgiving blue day after day. The creeks and streams that fed the valley shrank to muddy trickles and then disappeared entirely. The sun beat down relentlessly, baking the blighted fields into a cracked, barren wasteland. The grass in the pastures turned to tinder, and the cattle grew thin, their ribs showing like washboards. The town's confidence, built on generations of predictable seasons and reliable harvests, began to crumble. The communal grain silo, meant to see them through any winter, was half empty, and much of what remained was tainted by the blight. Mr. Gable's store shelves grew bare as people panic-bought what little he had. The price of flour tripled, then quadrupled, then became irrelevant as there was none left to sell. The town's foundations, its farms, its commerce, its faith in the land, were failing all at once. Fear, A quiet guest at first, soon became the master of every house. In her hollow, Eliza was an island in a sea of despair. The drought that scorched the world above could not touch her subterranean sanctuary. The cool, damp air continued its slow, steady exhalation from the well. Her clay cistern, fed by the patient weeping of the limestone walls, still provided her with a cup of clean, cold water every few hours. It was more than enough. And her crop, the one born of darkness and decay, thrived. The blight that consumed the sun-fed grains of the valley could not touch her mushrooms. They were a different order of life, drawing their sustenance from the earth itself, not the fickle sky. She continued her harvests, basket after basket of firm, white flesh. Her stores of dried mushrooms grew into a small mountain, while the world above starved. Her small hut smelled of abundance, the rich, earthy scent of her endless harvest. She was entirely self-sufficient, a fact that felt both like a triumph and a profound isolation. The first visitor arrived on a blistering afternoon in late summer. It was Sarah Gable, the mercantile owner's wife. She was a woman who had always worn her status with a quiet pride, her dresses neat, her hair perfectly coiffed. The woman who stumbled up to Eliza's hut was almost unrecognizable. Her dress was dusty, her face etched with desperation, and her eyes were hollow with sleepless nights. She did not knock, but simply stood there, swaying slightly, until Eliza emerged from the hut. "Please," Mrs. Gable whispered, her voice cracking. "My youngest, my Daniel. He's sick. The doctor says it's just hunger, but he's wasting away. He won't take the thin broth we can make." She looked at Eliza, shame and a wild, desperate hope warring in her eyes. "They talk in town. They call you. They say you have food. They say you grow things in the dark. I know it's just talk, but I had to come. I'll pay you anything." Eliza looked at the woman, who had stood by silently while her husband advised her to flee. She remembered the whispers, the pity, the condescending certainty of her failure. A cold, hard knot of satisfaction tightened in her chest. She could say no. She could turn this woman away and let the town that had cast her out reap the bitter harvest of its judgment. The thought was as tempting as it was ugly. But then she saw the image of a small, wasting child. She saw not the wife of a town merchant, but a mother, terrified and helpless. And she saw her own reflection in that terror, the memory of her own helplessness on the courthouse steps. Her own carefully hoarded resources were finite. Helping others meant putting herself at risk. It was a choice. The choice was never really in doubt, not for the woman she had become. The hardness in her chest dissolved. She stepped aside. "Come in," she said. She led the stunned woman into the dim interior of the hut. Mrs. Gable's eyes widened, taking in the strings of drying mushrooms hanging from the rafters, the neat stack of firewood, the simmering pot that smelled rich and savory. Eliza ladled a bowl of thick mushroom stew and handed it to her. "Eat," she said. "You walked a long way." Then she took a large basket and filled it to the brim with a mix of fresh and dried mushrooms. "Boil the dried ones into a broth for your son," she instructed, her voice calm and practical. "It's strong. Start with a little. When he can stomach it, chop the fresh ones fine and add them to the soup." She pushed the basket into Mrs. Gable's hands. "There is no charge." Sarah Gable stared, first at the basket, then at Eliza. She couldn't understand. "But why?" she stammered. We thought you were—" "I know what you thought," Eliza said, her voice devoid of triumph or accusation. "But a child is hungry." She led the woman to the door, the rescue already complete. Before she left, Mrs. Gable's curiosity overcame her shame. "How?" she asked, gesturing around the hut. "On this land? How is any of this possible?" For an answer, Eliza simply lifted the heavy wooden cover from the wellhead. She lit a lantern and lowered it into the shaft. She gestured for the other woman to look. Sarah Gable crept forward and peered into the depths. Her gasp echoed in the small hut. She saw the impossible garden in the lantern's glow, the neat rows of logs and sacks, all covered in a ghostly white bounty. It wasn't witchcraft. It was labor. It was genius. It was a complete and utter refutation of everything the town believed about this land, and about the woman who tended it. She looked up at Eliza, her eyes filled with a new and profound awe. News of the Gable boys' miraculous recovery spread through Providence Creek like wildfire. The mushroom broth had worked. Within a day, the child was sitting up, and within 3, he was asking for more. The story Sarah Gable told was even more potent. Not of a witch in a hovel, but of a woman who had built a fortress of sustenance in a place of death, who had a cellar that produced endless food, and who had given it freely. Soon, a trickle of visitors to Thomas's Folly became a steady stream. They were mothers with hungry children, old men too proud to beg, but too weak to hide their need. They came with shame in their eyes, remembering their mockery and their pity. Eliza met them all with the same quiet grace. She gave what she could, organizing a fair system of rationing. She did not ask for money. She asked for things her small homestead lacked. A few chickens from one family, a pregnant goat from another, a better axe, a saw, nails, a cast-iron pot. She bartered her impossible harvest for the building blocks of a better life. One day, a figure appeared on the horizon, walking, not riding. It was Marcus Davies. He had lost weight. His fine clothes hung on his frame, and his face was a mask of weary defeat. His farm was gone, his cattle sold for a pittance, his workers scattered. He had nothing left but his pride, and he had come to surrender that as well. He stopped before her, not at the door of her hut, but a respectful distance away, as if asking permission to approach. Buster growled low in his throat, but Eliza quieted him with a touch. "Eliza," he began, his voice rough. He couldn't meet her eyes. He looked at the ground, at the thriving chickens scratching in the dirt, at the solid little goat tethered nearby. "I have come, not for myself, but there are families who stayed loyal to me. They have nothing. Their children." He trailed off, the words catching in his throat. Finally he looked up, and she saw that the arrogant certainty in his eyes had been replaced by a deep and painful humility. "We were wrong," he said, the admission costing him everything. "We left you on this rock to die. We called you a fool. My God, we were the fools." This was the moment she had unknowingly been waiting for, the vindication, the apology from the man who had wronged her more than any other. She could have savored it. She could have reminded him of his cruelty, of his condescending offers. She could have turned him away. Instead, she simply nodded, accepting the truth of his words without comment. She went into the hut and returned with the largest sack of dried mushrooms she had. "This will make a lot of soup," she said, her tone practical, as if they were merely neighbors discussing a trade. "Tell me what else you need." Her grace was a more powerful judgment than any condemnation could have been. It broke the last of his pride. He took the sack, his hands trembling slightly. "Thank you," he whispered. It was the humblest word he had ever spoken. The drought broke in the autumn, but the famine's effects lingered through the winter. Throughout that long, hard season, Eliza's well was the heart of Providence Creek. It was no longer Thomas's Folly or the home of the Folly Girl. It was the Giving Cellar, a place of pilgrimage and survival. The community, led by a changed Marcus Davies and a grateful Mr. Gable, helped her build a proper, small house next to her original hut, which now served as a workshop and curing room. They brought her lumber and glass for a window. They dug a new, larger cistern for her, working under her direction. They did not just take, they learned. Eliza taught them which wild roots were edible, how to make a nourishing broth from bark and pine needles, and, most importantly, the principles of her subterranean farm. She showed them that the value of land was not just in its sun-drenched surface, but in its deep, hidden strengths. The nickname they had given her in mockery was retired, spoken now only with shame. In its place, they simply called her Eliza, a name that now carried more weight than any title in the valley. In the years that followed, Providence Creek recovered, but it was never the same. It was humbler, wiser, and more resilient. People began to dig deep cellars beneath their homes, creating cool, stable environments for storing food, and in some cases, for growing their own mushroom crops. The devastating memory of the blight and drought had taught them not to rely on a single way of life. The landscape around Eliza's homestead changed. The small plot of land grew as Marcus deeded her 20 of his best surviving acres, a public and legally binding act of restitution. Her farm blossomed. She had a small herd of goats, a flock of chickens, a large vegetable garden irrigated by a carefully managed water system, and, at its heart, the ever-producing well. Her story spread beyond the valley. Traders and travelers carried the tale of the widow who grew a fortune in a dry well, of the town that was saved by what it had thrown away. People came to see the place, to learn her methods. Eliza's well became a landmark, a symbol of ingenuity born from desperation. She never became wealthy in the way Marcus had been, with vast lands and herds. Her wealth was different. It was in her full larder, her sturdy home, her absolute independence, and the deep, abiding respect of the community that had once cast her out. Years later, Eliza stood at the stone lip of the well, now enclosed within a clean, well-built cellar house. She was no longer a desperate young widow, but a woman in her prime, her hands still calloused, her face lined by sun and wisdom. She looked down into the darkness, where lanterns now hung on permanent hooks, illuminating a thriving enterprise that fed her and half the county. The well had given her more than just food. It had taken her at her lowest point, stripped of everything, and forced her to dig deep, not just into the earth, but into herself. It had taught her that the most desolate places can hold the seeds of life, and that what the world dismisses as worthless is often the source of true strength. She had built more than a farm. She had built a life, on her own terms, from the ground down. And in the cool, earthy air rising from the depths, she felt not the echo of her past sorrows, but the quiet, steady breath of her own enduring peace.